beginning such a conversation in a business-like manner. And I want to conclude by saying that the situation in the world once again confirms that the upcoming anniversaries this year of our relations with the People's Republic of China will be devoted not only to ceremonial events, although this is very important. It is important to maintain among our public opinion, both in Russia and in China, it is important to maintain awareness of the significance of our friendship, our strategic partnership, our readiness to act shoulder to shoulder in current conditions. And of course, these anniversary contacts will to a large extent be devoted to defining our common interests and working out concrete approaches to advancing these interests in conditions of the most profound changes on the international arena. When the world, as a result of the West's attempts to preserve its dominance, is transitioning from globalization to the fragmentation of development processes, a fragmentation which is the forced form of liberation from diktat within the framework of those mechanisms of the world economy and world finance that were created at the West's initiative and continue to be controlled by it. Major reforms are maturing, and the role of such structures as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20 in shaping new mechanisms of global governance will, of course, only grow. And in this sense, the new recent initiative of Beijing, put forward at the end of August of last year, the Global Governance Initiative, which is now being actively considered in terms of forming the structures that could engage in this. This initiative is very, very timely. Today, Chairman Xi Jinping, when receiving our delegation, spoke of the significance of this initiative for consolidating the world majority in favor of efforts to ensure the manageability and orderliness of international relations on the basis of, once again this was emphasized, the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Here we and our Chinese friends have an enormous field of further work. Thank you very much. Especially given that the international situation, which is now being aggravated by the actions of our Western colleagues in Ukraine, in Latin America, in the Strait of Hormuz, and in other parts of our common Eurasian continent with China, this international situation has a direct impact on how bilateral relations develop between any states, including, of course, between Russia and China, between Russia and China, and our other partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in BRICS, and in other multilateral associations. In this regard, we reviewed how the agreements reached by President Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping on building trade, economic, and investment cooperation are being fulfilled in such a way as to protect it from the harmful influence of those who rely not on their ability to compete fairly, but on sanctions and other illegal methods of coercion, blackmail, and diktat. And of course, we noted that we are successfully coping with these tasks that were set at the highest level. For the fourth year in a row, trade turnover exceeds $200 billion. This goal was set at one point, achieved ahead of schedule, and it is steadily maintained as the foundation of our material and practical cooperation. Specialized structures, above all the mechanism of annual meetings of heads of government and the 5 intergovernmental commissions that operate within this mechanism, at the level of deputy prime ministers, are addressing tasks in a wide variety of areas, starting with energy, which of course takes on special significance in current conditions, but also including high technologies, space, research in the field of nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, education, and culture. Speaking of humanitarian issues, in January of this year, President Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping launched yet another, already the 14th, cross-year. This time, unlike previous years of culture, it is a cross-year of education. As part of the preparation of President Putin's visit to China in the first half of this year, we proposed that special attention be paid to this area of education in preparing the summit agenda. And of course, on the international front, we are interested in countering the blatant attempts by the West, both the United States and Europe, to maintain and in some places even renew their hegemony, counting on the fact that 500 years of experience conquering the world, subordinating it to their interests, ensuring such mechanisms of global governance that allow living at the expense of others, including the slave trade, colonialism, and much else, can somehow be modernized, and that by modern methods one can continue, as I have already said, to live at the expense of others, to subordinate others to one's will. Neither China nor the Russian Federation, like the overwhelming majority of the world's countries, can agree with such an approach, and we reviewed the situation in various regions, paying special attention to Eurasia, where more and more hotbeds of tension are emerging. In Europe, this is NATO's activity in seeking a new meaning for its existence, primarily through drawing Ukraine into its ranks. This is the militarization of the European Union, which we observe against the backdrop of crisis phenomena within NATO due to disagreements between Washington and European capitals, primarily the Brussels bureaucracy. The Middle East and the Persian Gulf zone, where the most attention-grabbing events are currently taking place, is an obvious crisis node that will be very difficult to untangle. Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank must not remain in the shadows and must not be pushed to the background. We made this very clear today with the Chinese delegation. Central Asia is also seeing an interesting geopolitical struggle due to the West's attempts there as well to establish its rules and play a leading role in how the lives of Central Asian states are organized and with whom they build their relations. The same can be observed, perhaps less obviously, in the South Caucasus, not to mention the long-standing crisis phenomena that have been accumulating for many years as a result of Western policy in Southeast Asia, in Northeast Asia, primarily on the Korean Peninsula, in the Taiwan Strait, and in the South and East China Seas. That is, our entire Eurasian continent is in one way or another the arena of very serious opposing tendencies and practical actions on the part of the leading members of the world community. It is the largest and richest continent. Its resources are essentially inexhaustible, and therefore the geopolitical and geo-economic components are of special significance here. Our presidents and the representatives of the People's Republic of China have traditionally paid special attention to this process during their candid contacts through reciprocal visits. Russia and China also attach special importance to this matter within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, within BRICS, within our relations with ASEAN, in the relations between the Eurasian Economic Union and China in the context of Beijing's Belt and Road project. So we mainly talked about the problems of Eurasia, especially since they are now coming to the forefront of world politics, increasingly absorbing the attention of the audience. But this does not mean that we are not concerned with strengthening positive trends and neutralizing negative ones in other regions of the world. This concerns Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba. It also concerns, of course, the African continent, which, having undergone the process of political decolonization, remains in the strongest economic dependence on its former metropolises. Now Africa is beginning its second awakening. I have spoken about this more than once, striving for economic independence so as to stop playing the same colonial, neo-colonial role of a raw material appendage for the West and to begin benefiting from industrialization. We remember how the Soviet Union actively helped the liberated countries of the Black Continent move in this direction, strengthening their independence. And we, together with the People's Republic of China, want to continue helping Africans take their fate, their countries, and their economies into their own hands. I wanted to be brief, but it seems I wasn't. Yet I am ready for questions.
Уважаемый господин министр, у меня следующий вопрос. В нынешнем году Россия и Китай отмечают 30-летие установления стратегического взаимодействия, а также 20-летие нашего основополагающего договора о добрососедстве, дружбе и сотрудничестве.
This year, Russia and China are marking the 30th anniversary of the establishment of strategic cooperation, as well as the 20th anniversary of our foundational treaty on good neighborliness, friendship, and cooperation.
I fully agree with the characterization of our relations as relations unshakable in the face of any storm. This is not merely a slogan, it is a statement of fact, which has already been proven by a whole series of processes in which Russia and China play a stabilizing role in the tendencies that are now competing to prevail in international life. The tendencies we support consist precisely in unwavering cooperation in order to promote the ideals of justice, the ideals of equality, the ideals of non-interference in each other's internal affairs, the ideals of respect for the sovereignty of every state, and of course, respect for the right of peoples to choose their own path of development. All of this is enshrined in the UN Charter. And when Russia and China put forward their objectives, formulated in the form of the slogan you just mentioned, and there are other slogans too, shoulder to shoulder, back to back, promoting our interests. We mean, first and foremost, the necessity for all countries to return to respect for the UN Charter. But unfortunately, our Western colleagues, even when they signed the UN Charter in 1945, did not, as in the case of signing many other documents in the subsequent era, actually intend to fully comply with the UN Charter. Take such a principle of this document, the most important document of international law, as the sovereign equality of states. Look at any actions of the West after 1945, when this principle became international law, and see how much the West observed the requirements of sovereign equality of states, of respect for the sovereign equality of each state. In not a single conflictual episode of our past history was this observed, nor is it observed now, as confirmed by the self-arrogated right of the West, Europeans and Americans, to declare someone a pariah, to impose economic sanctions against someone, to ban someone from entering somewhere, to sever already signed agreements in the field of cultural exchanges, to expel someone from festivals merely because a person has not signed on to what are openly Russophobic neo-Nazi slogans of the Brussels bureaucracy. Therefore, with the People's Republic of China, you know, strength lies in truth. And what is the truth? The truth is that everyone has ratified the UN Charter, and it must be fulfilled. And we, like our Chinese friends, while remaining committed to all those lofty ideals enshrined in the UN Charter, regard them not merely as ideals, but as a guide to action. And that is why we have very firm positions. And that is why Russia and China are supported by a large group of countries that we call the global majority.
Could you tell us what will be memorable about this, if there is some program in this regard? And what is the likelihood that President Putin's visit to China will fall precisely on the date of July 16th?
И какова вероятность, что именно на эту дату, 16 июля, придется визит президента России в Китай? То есть вы хотите, чтобы я сказал, чем запомнится то, что еще не произошло?
I think that the program that will accompany the procedure for renewing the treaty is being agreed upon. And I think you understand perfectly well that in state affairs, programs of this kind are not disclosed until they have been finally approved. The same applies to the timing and the substance of visits, of any visits, and especially those at the highest level.
Viktor Sinyok, Minsovetsie, Sergei Viktorovich. Due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, China is experiencing a shortage of energy resources. Can Russia help make up for this shortage? Was this topic discussed in the negotiations, and in particular, was the question of implementing the Power of Siberia 2 project raised?
Russia can, of course, make up for the resource shortfall that has arisen both for the PRC and for other countries that are interested in working with us on an equal and mutually beneficial basis. Russia has spoken about this more than once. The President has touched on this topic, including in connection with the plans of European states, in the form of the European Commission, to completely sever any ties with Russia in the energy sector, meaning the supply of our hydrocarbons. It is not for nothing that now in Europe, when this crisis erupted following the unprovoked aggression of the USA and Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is not for nothing that in Europe, official figures are already appealing to the European Commission to take pity on the national sovereignty of EU member states and to postpone the plans for completely shutting off the tap. Speaking figuratively, they are beginning to understand that if Europe now gets off the Russian oil and gas needle, as they put it, it may automatically fall onto the aspen stake of the energy dependence of another great power, and that other great power is already actively sharpening this aspen stake for the Europeans. So now there is such a pivotal moment, which is quite interesting. But in a more global sense, Power of Siberia 2 is a project that has long been under discussion between Moscow and Beijing. They have been comparing its advantages with the energy infrastructure routes that have already been created, and how they will harmoniously combine, including with those projects being developed in Central Asia within the framework of the Belt and Road. This is a vast continent, and one very much wants, within the framework of what President Putin has called the emerging Greater Eurasian Partnership, to avoid duplication and to create a group of integration participants who, while developing their sub-regional programs, will harmonize and complement each other. The Eurasian Economic Union has such relations with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It, EAEU, also has an intergovernmental agreement with the People's Republic of China on the harmonious combination of the Eurasian Union's integration plans with the implementation of the Belt and Road Project. Both the SCO and the Eurasian Economic Union cooperate with ASEAN. These are, as we see it, the three most active integration associations that seek to coordinate their actions with one another and thereby maximally extract benefit from the advantages afforded by our geopolitical and geo-economic position, primarily our belonging to the great Eurasian continent. But all of this was happening under conditions where the rules of the game in international markets, including energy markets, were more or less observed. Let me recall that these rules were set by none other than the West, primarily within its model of globalization, which the United States actively promoted after the World War, having lined up all its other allies behind it. And promoting this globalization, the dominant role of the dollar, ensuring, in practice, as they believed, that all respected the principles of free competition, the presumption of innocence, the inviolability of property, and much else that has now been thrown on the scrap heap. This process began even before the special military operation under the first Trump administration and under Biden as well, of course, and now continues with renewed force within the framework of the sanctions that remain despite everything introduced by the previous administration, which the new administration is maintaining, reinforcing, and expanding. They remain in the discrimination of Russian companies on global energy markets, and of course, they manifest in the direct consequences of the aggressive military policy and military actions to which the United States resorts. Take Venezuelan oil. First, they announced that Maduro needed to be brought to heel because he is the main drug lord, but now no one remembers about the drugs anymore. Now they say the drugs come from Mexico, but we somehow came to an arrangement there. But Maduro, we took him away. Now the oil is ours. They planned the same thing with regard to Iran. President Trump has said more than once that he is ready to take Iranian oil, or at minimum, to reach an agreement to jointly manage Iranian oil with Iran. Now the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. It was never blocked before the attack on Iran, never created any problems with the movement of goods in one direction and the other. Not only energy resources, oil, liquefied, and natural gas, but also food, fertilizers. Many things that, incidentally, largely ensured, and I hope will ensure in significant measure, the normal socio-economic development and normal lives of our close partners among the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf. All of this is now under great risk. And nearby, on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, where the waterways that begin in the Mediterranean Sea pass through the Suez Canal and then reach the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, which washes the shores of Yemen, including those parts now controlled by the Ansar Allah movement, the Houthis, who are allies of Iran. Now, they are already being warned that they too will be bombed if they try to interfere with navigation in this most important artery for world trade. But the question is not who will do what, and who will punish whom. The question, as always, is in the root causes. I have been speaking regularly with my friends from the Arab states of the Gulf over the past few weeks, often with practically all of them, and they cannot object to a thesis that sounds very simply: would Iran have taken any steps to block the Strait of Hormuz, to strike American facilities on the Arabian Peninsula, if it were not for the aggression by Washington and Israel against the Islamic Republic? Everyone understands that this would not have happened. Therefore, as in any other conflict, the root cause is precisely this aggressive line, and behind it lie two things. For Israel, it is, of course, an utterly unshakable conviction that Iran must be destroyed. How can one believe in this? I do not know. I do not understand. President Trump also said, it kind of slipped out of him, that I will destroy this civilization. You know what kind of resonance that caused. But beyond the ideological drive toward overthrowing the regime that embodies a culture and civilization existing for many thousands of years. And such a goal in itself, of course, cannot command either respect from a universal human standpoint or respect from the standpoint of anyone's conviction in its achievability. And the second task is, once again, the oil markets, which the United States above all sets for itself, in addition to supporting Israel. So one could reason about this at length, but we, together with the People's Republic of China, thank God, have all the means, both those already deployed and reserve capacities and planned capabilities, so as not to depend on such aggressive ventures that undermine the world economy and world energy.
Donald Copper, Russia Today. Sergei Viktorovich. Moscow is warning more and more often about the militarization of the European Union in anticipation of the so-called possible war with Russia. How does this affect Serbia's cooperation with Russia and China, especially given that they are permanent members of the UN Security Council who have not recognized the legality of Kosovo's independence and are an important pillar in preserving Serbia's territorial integrity?
Спасибо. Москва предупреждает о опасности милитаризации Евросоюза.
Thank you. Moscow warns about the danger of the EU's militarization. But the main thing in what is happening is not that we are warning, but that the militarization is proceeding very rapidly and intensely. And it is not concealed that this very militarization is viewed by current European elites as, if you will, a guarantee of their own existence. The Americans are in every way cultivating these processes, the processes of Europe's militarization, in line with their policy of shedding responsibility for the security of the old continent. They want everything that was brought about by unleashing a war against Russia through the Ukrainian regime, an illegal regime brought to power by the West 12 years ago. They want all the consequences of this adventure to be borne by Europe, so that these consequences no longer burden the American treasury. This is being said in plain text. Mr. Keith Kellogg, who was one of Trump's special representatives on Ukrainian affairs. In particular, he was given the task of communicating with the Kyiv regime, is now actively promoting the idea of creating a new military alliance, not drawing Ukraine into NATO, because that has apparently already been rejected by President Trump and other members of his administration. And Kellogg, being no stranger to Washington, is promoting, together with the European grandees, as they are called, the idea of creating a new military bloc with Ukraine as a member, and not even just a member, but as its leading participant. And Zelensky is actively supporting this idea. And one of the leading military figures, the first senior deputy head of the Pentagon, Mr. Colby, recently stated at Senate hearings that Trump is inclined to push Russia and Ukraine toward a compromise. And I will even quote him now. He views achieving peace on terms fair to Kyiv as the most important element of a system of long-term deterrence of Russia. That is essentially everything one needs to know about how the negotiation process, initiated at the initiative of Donald Trump and President Putin, a process we welcomed and continue to express readiness to continue, is going, although we also experienced, and we saw this half a year ago, even more than half a year ago, in August 2025 in Alaska, that we accepted proposals which, as we were convinced, were put forward by the United States with an open heart and the best of intentions. Unfortunately, since then, these agreements, not the spirit, but the agreements and the understanding reached in Alaska, are being blocked and torpedoed by that very European ruling elite that has settled in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, and who are being actively echoed from London, and who even try to conduct this discordant choir from London, and who openly want to preserve the Russophobic charge of the entire European continent, including NATO, the European Union, and now a new bloc is being conceived with Ukraine as its main participant. Zelensky says directly that Ukraine will protect Europe from Russia, and all of this against the backdrop of talk that after the cessation of hostilities, security guarantees must certainly be provided to Ukraine. The open conversation is about ensuring that the Zelensky regime, a Nazi regime, a Russophobic, openly racist regime that has banned Russian culture, the only country in the world that has done so, that receives absolutely no advice from the West on this matter and simply bans the Russian language, bans Russian education and culture. The canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And when we tell our Western colleagues who are trying to mediate, dear friends, this is wrong. Now let us reach some agreement somewhere on where we will stop the fighting and deal with this afterward. No, this does not need to be dealt with afterward. This is not something belonging to a list of conditions or negotiating positions. It is what any normal country is obligated to do. It is written in the UN Charter. Respect for every person's rights, including with regard to language and religion. It is written in numerous human rights conventions. It is also written, incidentally, in the Constitution of Ukraine. But despite all the talk about the European prospects of the Kyiv regime, not a single Western country has ever dared to tell it. You know what, dear friend? Before we get to specific things concerning the future of the Ukrainian state, let us first bring it to a normal human condition. No one does this. No one wants to talk about it. Instead, from Europe and from Washington come statements, just agree on something on the ground, on where you will stop with Russia, and we will immediately give you a guarantee. Incidentally, the deployment of stabilization forces is also mentioned. Macron is obsessed with this idea, Starmer also makes some agreeable noises about it, and the Americans say, Rubio said, not long ago, well, apparently the French and the British want to deploy some kind of stabilization contingent. It is clear that without the technologies possessed by the United States, they will not manage this. We will see. If there is peace, we will be ready to support them. That is, there is no talk at all about turning the Ukrainian regime into something normal, through elections, through imposing some requirements from the so-called democratic world. None whatsoever. I have wandered rather far from Kosovo, but not by chance. In Kosovo, the West demonstrated that the law does not apply to it, or rather, that the part of the law that suits it today applies to it. And what suited it then was the provision of the UN Charter concerning the equality of nations and every nation's right to self-determination. At the same time, the usual method for exercising such a right, namely holding a referendum or otherwise polling the population, the West had no intention whatsoever of organizing, and they proclaimed that Kosovo is an independent state. Never mind that a number of EU and NATO members have not recognized this conclusion. It is now being entrenched and promoted, and by all means fair and foul, they are trying to push Kosovo into the UN, into the Council of Europe, and into other organizations created for states, for sovereign states. And when the West needed to try to dismember the Russian Federation, to drive a wedge between us and the Ukrainian people, then all attempts to restore Russian lands, to restore to the Russian state the belonging of lands which that state had itself founded and on which had always lived a people forming part of the Russian state. When there was a need to try to put spokes in the wheels here, they said, there is no right to self-determination. There is an obligation to respect sovereignty. You know, once again, I am going far from Kosovo, but I will return. Quite recently, or rather, after the state coup in Kyiv, organized by the West 12 years ago, when Crimea rose up and left, when Novorossiya also refused to accept this regime, then came the great lie of the Minsk agreements, whose implementation was guaranteed by the Security Council. Had the implementation taken place, the conflict would of course have been exhausted long ago. We would not now be observing what is happening. Russia was ready to accept the Minsk agreements. It supported them, was their co-author, and was prepared to stop there if everyone else had also behaved honorably. And all this time, the UN Secretary-General and his spokesperson speaking about Ukraine stated that it was necessary to observe the UN Charter and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. To our questions about the right to self-determination, they dodged. And then suddenly, Donald Trump mentioned Greenland, and unexpectedly, the official spokesperson of Mr. Guterres, a Frenchman, declared, "We believe that the problem of Greenland should be resolved on the basis of the UN Charter, respecting both sovereignty and the right of a nation to self-determination." We officially inquired of the Secretariat's leadership, if Greenland has the right to self-determination, perhaps you will now retroactively recognize the right to self-determination of the peoples of Crimea, Novorossiya, and Donbass. That is a different story. I am not joking. That is to say, the primitivism of the policy pursued by the Secretariat's leadership is appalling, and the same applies to Kosovo. On Kosovo, the Secretariat hides behind the decision of the International Court of Justice, to which, incidentally, the Serbs appealed back in 2008. In 2009, shortly after Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence, the International Court of Justice issued a ruling that when part of a state declares its independence without the consent of the central authorities, this does not constitute a violation of international law. It is permitted. President Putin has more than once, in conversations with Western colleagues, reminded them of this ruling and said at the time, "We believed that in relation to Serbia, this was simply a betrayal of its history, because Kosovo is associated with many, many centuries of the history of the Serbian state. But since you, our president said to Western colleagues, since you have accepted this verdict of the International Court of Justice, why not apply it to the processes that occurred after the coup in Ukraine, especially since, unlike Kosovo, referendums were held there, and to suspect these referendums of falsification is simply impossible. There was a huge number of foreign observers. There is no answer. Therefore, regarding Serbia, I speak about Kosovo, I speak about other things, because probably the Serbian people should understand where they are being invited. And President Vučić, in conversations with President Putin and with your humble servant, has said more than once that the European perspective seems to him to be above all a matter of Serbia's economic interests and the interest of integrating into the infrastructure that the European Union has created. But this interest will always be realized without prejudice to relations with Russia, because the Serbian people, as all public opinion polls show, have a very warm, historically rooted attitude toward the Russian Federation, as well as toward the People's Republic of China. And President Vučić has said many times that he will not enter the European Union on conditions that are anti-Russian. We respect such a position, but we also hear what Europe is saying. Serbia is being told that it can resume accession negotiations if it fulfills two conditions. Recognize the independence of Kosovo, which is already sufficient to understand the anti-Serbian essence of this position by Brussels. And second, you must join all, without exception, the sanctions that the EU is adopting against the Russian Federation. They are trying to turn Serbia into some kind of buffer zone for countering Russia. Unlike the European Union, We are interested in there being unifying infrastructure on the Balkans, both economic and cultural, in every sense. The same goal is pursued by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is also very popular in the Balkans and is being actively promoted. Therefore, of course, we stand for the Serbian people, as does the People's Republic of China, and I have no doubt that we will respect the choice of the Serbian people themselves. They must be asked what future they envision for themselves, and President Vučić understands this perfectly well. He feels the mood of his citizens as a major and experienced politician. The question which I would formulate differently, especially since we have been talking about this topic for a long time, in contacts with the Americans, in contacts with the Israelis, with representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as in multilateral structures, in the Security Council. All of this began for us more than 10 years ago, when the agreement on the Iranian nuclear program was being developed, and ultimately the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for resolving this problem was agreed upon, in which Russia played a leading role, including in resolving the Iranian aspect of that agreement. Specifically, a certain quantity of uranium for energy needs was agreed upon, which Iran retained for use in research activities and electricity production. The remaining enriched uranium was transported to the Russian Federation, where it was also diluted and converted into fuel for the same Bushehr nuclear power plant. Therefore, Russia, as part of this equation, always played a constructive role, and this role was taken into account and recognized by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program. After the administration of Donald Trump withdrew from this plan, which was one of probably the most serious achievements of contemporary multilateral diplomacy, during his first term in the White House, the Europeans did not begin blaming Washington for violating such a good multilateral agreement. Instead, they began demanding that Iran continue to observe all the restrictions that this program imposed. Iran, with the support of Russia and China, we were all participants in these negotiations. We explained to Western colleagues that the agreement rested on the premise that its sustainability was ensured by reciprocity. And if one country, and a country like the United States, which played one of the most significant roles in the negotiations, simply says, "I am no longer bound by anything," then how can you demand that Iran observe the restrictions it took on, above and beyond the requirements contained in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and above and beyond the requirements contained in the Universal Guarantees from the IAEA? No, you are obligated to comply, and so on. And it was precisely the European Union that played the most harmful role in distorting the essence of the Security Council resolution devoted to the Iranian nuclear program, pulling off what is simply a disgraceful swindle for diplomacy, and now, on the basis of these adventurous actions, declaring that UN sanctions against Iran have been restored. Neither Russia nor China recognizes this, nor does the majority of other normal states, but we continue our relations with Iran in full conformity with international law, which currently does not provide for any international sanctions, but specifically about the problem that we are told is one of the unresolved ones in the negotiations that took place in Islamabad, which are apparently due to resume any day now, namely the problem of what is to be done with enriched uranium. I have communicated with Foreign Minister Aragchi. We communicate, as I have already said, with the American side as well. This topic has come up more than once over the past 2 or 3 months, including in President Putin's contacts with American as well as Israeli representatives and with Iranian ones too. We will accept any decision that suits the Iranian side within the framework of its legitimate rights. And international law provides that every country has the right to enrich uranium exclusively for peaceful purposes. And never, nowhere, not once, has Iran tried to expand these peaceful purposes to encompass some ambiguous interpretations, and thereby tried to use its technologies for military purposes. There is no evidence of this. In Iran, as you know, until the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei was brutally killed at the beginning of the aggression, there existed his fatwa categorically forbidding the production of nuclear weapons. And the IAEA, despite the fact that Iran was the most inspected country by the IAEA, not once did the IAEA record the existence of any suspicion that enriched uranium could have been directed toward military purposes. Therefore, the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes is an inalienable right of the Islamic Republic of Iran. How the Islamic Republic itself, in the course of the negotiations, will exercise this right, whether it will take a pause or will insist on preserving this right, any approach based on this principle, the principle of the universality of the right to enrichment, will be accepted by the Russian side. I very much hope that those directly participating in the negotiations, the American side, in this case, will be realists and will take into account the interests of the entire region and will not continue the unprovoked aggression from which those who primarily suffer, and most of all, let us call a spade, are the allies of the United States, namely the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf, our good friends. And we are not indifferent to how such adventures affect their economy, their well-being, their prosperity, their population.
Do you believe that Budapest has already been recommended from Brussels to reconsider the priorities of its foreign policy?
Как в этой связи Москва планирует выстраивать отношения с новыми властями в Будапеште, учитывая, что самому Будапешту из Брюсселя уже порекомендовали пересмотреть оперативно свою внешнюю политику и политику господина Орбана?
Ну, знаете, мы вежливые люди, поэтому, когда кто-то, ну, например, как президент Макрон, говорит, а я вот скоро позвоню Путину. Ну, мы воспринимаем это как его намерение позвонить Путину. И когда он потом не звонит, мы воспринимаем это как то, что у него изменилось настроение.
If the leader of the party that won in Hungary, Mr. Magyar, now says that he will not call Putin, we take this as his personal right to dispose of his own wishes. I do not even want to comment on this. We never shy away from dialogue. The President has said this many times and proved it many times with concrete actions. Of course, one would want the persons entering into dialogue with us to genuinely represent the national interests of their country and the interests of their people, then the dialogue is substantive.
Вступающие с нами в диалог, реально представляли интересы, национальные интересы своей страны, интересы своего народа. Тогда диалог получается предметным.
Sergei Viktorovich, Russia has confirmed its readiness to help regulate the Iranian issue. Is Moscow ready to take on a formal mediating role in a future agreement similar to the Normandy format? This is more about institutional support. Can Russia initiate a genuine inspection confirming the absence of Iran's nuclear weapons culture and people who settled in the USSR?
подтверждающие отсутствие у Ирана ядерного оружия или предоставить иные гарантии безопасности. Спасибо.
Россия исторически, вот, в рамках периода современной истории, была частью процесса, который в итоге привел к согласованию гарантий урегулирования иранской ядерной программы.
Russia has historically been part of the process that ultimately led to the agreement on guarantees for settling the Iranian nuclear program. The same joint comprehensive plan of action agreed upon by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Iran, plus Germany, and which was approved by a Security Council resolution. In this comprehensive plan, and in the resolution that approved it, there is everything necessary to allay any concerns about Iran ever beginning the production of nuclear weapons. And in this plan, in this resolution, there is everything necessary to ensure reliable monitoring against the transfer of Iran's peaceful nuclear program onto a military track. The fact that the United States destroyed this program, which Israel always wanted, and this happened back in 2019, is a sad fact of modern world history. And now the only hope is that something similar can be reconstructed from the ruins of what I consider a very significant multilateral diplomatic agreement. And Russia, as when that program was agreed in 2015, is ready to play its role in resolving the problem of enriched uranium. This role can take many different forms, including the reprocessing of highly enriched uranium to fuel-grade level, transfer for storage in Russia of a certain quantity, everything that will be acceptable to Iran without, I repeat once again, violating its inalienable right, as with any other state, the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. A negotiation process is now underway in Islamabad. The first round has taken place. The parties have commented on it differently, but they apparently do not refuse to continue. We will see. This should become clear literally within the next day or two. At the same time, there is a group of countries that want to organize external diplomatic support for the efforts aimed at a settlement. I mean Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. They have already gathered in such a format. We are in contact with all of these states and with their representatives who are dealing with the problem of resolving issues related to navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and more broadly with the Iranian problem. Today, we discuss this with our Chinese friends. We have the readiness to assist these efforts if our assistance and Chinese assistance will be called upon. In this connection, let me recall that many years ago, our country put forward a proposal to develop a security concept for the Persian Gulf zone, which would unite the 6 Arab monarchies belonging to the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as their immediate neighbors, in particular Iraq and Jordan. And at the time, we envisioned that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council could constitute an outer ring, accompanying negotiations that, following the principle of those glorious times of the all-European process, would be devoted to developing security guarantees, confidence-building measures, transparency in the conduct of military exercises, and so on. This initiative did not ripen to the point of yielding results, although at least several meetings of political scientists from all the countries I mentioned were held, who found it quite promising. But there were also those who categorically did not want to allow any steps leading to normalization of relations between the Arabs and Iran, particularly in the Persian Gulf zone. Subsequently, before these military actions began, before the aggression was unleashed, and even before the aggression of last June, 2 or 3 years before it, we tried to revive interest in this idea. Our Chinese colleagues put forward a similar initiative and did a great deal to begin a practical process of reconciliation and normalization between the Arabs and Iran. In particular, it was precisely the People's Republic of China, the PRC leadership, who quietly, without any fanfare, facilitated the reaching of agreements between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic. And this too did not please everyone, because now you observe what is happening, and behind all of this, in addition to the desire for the existential elimination of Persian civilization, as was declared, in addition to the desire to obtain oil or to establish control over it, there is, of course, also this underlying aspiration not to allow rapprochement and normalization between the Arabs and Iran. For this purpose, among other things, the intra-Islamic tribal contradictions between Sunnis and Shia are being actively exploited and played upon. We, like the PRC, try to act in the opposite direction. And we were discussing yesterday with Minister Wang Yi, discussing how we can, at this stage, facilitate such normalization. I will not go into details, but we feel a growing interest in actually achieving such normalization. We will see how things go, but the position of the Gulf Cooperation Council itself will play a most important role. The Islamic Republic has publicly stated that it is ready for such interaction among the littoral states, so that the Gulf and the Strait become waters of peace, cooperation, and mutual benefit.
Good afternoon, Sergei Viktorovich. On Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that the U.S. might look at Cuba after resolving all issues with Iran. How do you assess the likelihood of this U.S. threat against Cuba being carried out, and what consequences could such a step have both for Cuba itself and for the situation in the world as a whole? And has Cuba approached Russia with a request for mediation in negotiations with the United States?
Thank you. I will not speculate right now, because we have heard many statements from Washington, And far from all of these statements subsequently took on the material form of practical actions. We have repeatedly confirmed our firm support for the sovereignty and independence of our Cuban friends. And the statements of Cuba's leadership, including President Diaz-Canel, confirm the resolve to defend the freedom of the island of freedom to the end by all methods at their disposal. We, of course, provide Cuba, as does the People's Republic of China, with support, both political, within the framework of the United Nations, and at other forums, and economic and humanitarian. We sent the first tanker with 100,000 tons of oil for Cuba. Of course, that will last a couple of months. I am not an expert, but that we will continue such assistance, and that the People's Republic of China will also continue to participate in such support, I have no doubt whatsoever. And I very much hope that the United States will not return to the times of direct colonial wars, of colonial suppression of free peoples. It was not Cuba that refused dialogue with Washington for many long decades. Washington did everything to isolate the Cuban state, although the Europeans maintained diplomatic relations with Cuba for a long time and continue to maintain those relations, while Washington tried to change the regime by strangling the Cuban economy. And this line, unfortunately, continues now. I would advise the United States, in all those situations where it dislikes some government, to begin a dialogue with that government. Not a single example in history, including Venezuela, has ever refused dialogue with the USA. The USA would reach agreements and then retreat from its own promises. And there were agreements with Cuba even under the Obama administration. Agreements that Havana accepted and which were mutually respectful and mutually beneficial. With courtesy and good manners, one can achieve far more than with the opposite traits of human character.
На фоне объявленной Трампом блокады Ормузского пролива возникла угроза перекрытия еще одного важного пролива, о котором мы говорили сегодня, Бабель-Мандебского, через который также идут поставки энергоносителей. Допускают ли в Москве, что в отсутствии мирного урегулирования и из-за возрастающего давления на экономики стран региона Персидского залива эти государства могут вступить в конфликт? И насколько, по вашим оценкам, велика вероятность вообще разрастания текущего конфликта? Какие действия предпринимаются Москвой и Пекином в избежании этого сценария? Спасибо большое.
Several times in my answers, I have touched on this topic. They want to draw them into war. I said that there is a strong desire among those who started this war not to allow normalization of relations between the Arabs and Iran. There is a strong desire to advance the concept of two wars. The fact that Iran has been attacked by the United States and Israel means nothing from the point of view of Iran's right to respond, because it begins to respond on the territory of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. And they did not attack. They declared from the very beginning that they would not provide their airspace, would not allow American bases on their territory to be used for attacking Iran. All of this took place, and we actively supported it in our contacts with the Arabs, including at the highest level. The President had contacts with the President of the UAE and with other leaders. We emphasized that we greatly respect this position. And we do not merely respect their position, we are in solidarity with them in that they should
не
not
солидарны в
suffer
том,
from
что
this
они не должны
war.
страдать от этого.
But let us be honest. I
Но,
speak with all my
давайте
colleagues.
будем честными.
It was impossible
Разговариваем
not
со
to
всеми своими
understand
коллегами.
that U.S. military
Не понимать,
facilities on the territory of
что
Iran's Arab
военные
neighbors
объекты США
would be
на
targets that
территории
Iran would
арабских
strike
соседей Ирана
in
будут
response to
целями,
aggression against itself.
а,
It was impossible not
которые
to
Иран будет
understand
атаковать
this.
в ответ на
Everyone
агрессию против
understood
него.
it perfectly well.
Этого было нельзя.
And
Все это
now,
прекрасно
when
понимают.
attempts were made,
И сейчас,
incidentally
когда,
primarily with American help,
вот,
to push through a security
пытались,
resolution
кстати,
that
с помощью
simply condemned
американских
Iran for an
пытались
unprovoked
продвинуть
attack
Совете
on its
Безопасности
neighbors
резолюцию,
and for
которая
blocking the Strait of Hormuz without
просто
mentioning a
осуждала
single
Иран за
word about
неспровоцированное
what preceded
нападение
it.
на
Well,
своих
we and the
соседей
People's
и,
Republic of
за
China
перекрытие
very
Амурского
honestly
пролива,
explained
не
that this
упоминая
resolution,
вообще ни
first of
слова
all,
о том,
does not
что
reflect the
этому
objective
предшествовало.
process. It was again being
Ну, вот
used
мы с
to
Государственной
advance that
Республикой
very cancel
очень честно
culture.
объяснили,
The
что
West
эта
loves to
резолюция,
cancel the
во-первых, не
historical
отражает
period that is
объективного
inconvenient
процесса,
for
она
it
опять
in justifying its
использовалась
actions
для
in
продвижения
one
той
or
самой
another crisis,
культуры отмены.
just as it began the modern history of the Ukrainian crisis by accusing us, you simply annexed Crimea. We say, well, the population of Crimea simply refused to recognize the coup. No, no, no. The coup is a peculiar manifestation of democracy. But you went ahead and, exactly the same way, in any other situation where the prehistory and root cause are inconvenient for the West, it simply cancels them. In precisely the same way, in this resolution, which we and the People's Republic of China did not support and did not allow to be adopted, the root cause was erased. And for future generations, it would have remained on record that Iran simply started attacking its neighbors. That this resolution would not have changed anything was proven by history, which developed several hours after that Security Council session, when it was announced that there would be peace negotiations in Islamabad. That is, if this resolution had passed, Iran, which was being unjustly condemned in it, would of course have been antagonized, and the negotiations might not have taken place, and we would all have understood the reason for Iran's such a position. Or if these negotiations had not taken place and the war had continued, those who attacked Iran would have said, you see, the Security Council approves of us. We are acting in accordance with the Security Council. Neither one nor the other is needed, neither by us, nor by our Chinese colleagues, nor by the Arab countries themselves, nor by anyone. Such use of the Security Council in its crudest form is needed by no one. It undermines the authority of the UN. It undermines the authority of its Security Council. Therefore, we insist that these negotiations continue and that an agreement be reached on restoring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. This will make it possible to remove the risks of a repetition of this situation in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The leaders of Ansar Allah and the Houthis have already announced that only if this aggression continues will they be forced to resort to such measures. One must not provoke such phenomena, which are killing a large part of the world economy. And the Strait of Hormuz, throughout all the years of the existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran, was never mentioned among the problems in the sphere of freedom of navigation, freedom of trade, along maritime waters. Never. And all the problems arose only with the attack of February 28th, again, in the midst of negotiations. Therefore, we, together with the People's Republic of China, firmly stand for these negotiations to continue, for the parties to advance realistic and fair goals in them, with full consideration of the legitimate rights of each party in accordance with international law. And we, together with the People's Republic of China, are ready to support various formats of external accompaniment of these negotiations. We also spoke about this in detail yesterday.
Thank you, Sergei Viktorovich. Our relations with China are strengthening. As for relations between Moscow and Washington, have we managed to overcome this freezing point, in particular the negotiations on Ukraine? Or are they nevertheless frozen, or is there hope for their resumption? You did, of course, mention some dubious processes that were taking place in Washington, various directions, but officially, can they be resumed?
Relations are not frozen. They were frozen under Biden, whose administration completely severed all contacts. There was a summit in June 2021 in Geneva. It seemed to me to be an open, serious conversation between two experienced politicians. But then the United States began assembling against us a coalition of Western and some states dependent on the West and on Washington, raising a wave of accusations directed at us that we were preparing to conquer Ukraine. You remember all these stories. In response to this, by instruction of President Putin, we proposed concluding treaties on security guarantees between Russia and the USA, between Russia and NATO, which would clearly fix what had been agreed many, many years ago, not just 1 decade ago, namely that NATO would not expand and absorb the post-Soviet space. We were categorically and arrogantly refused. This was my part in this process. In January 2022, I met with Tony Blinken, also in Geneva. He said this was not up for discussion, with that sense of superiority that was characteristic of the talking heads of that administration. Then what happened, happened. The categorical refusal to provide guarantees of NATO's non-expansion and of Ukraine's non-accession to NATO led to relations becoming completely closed, not through our fault, incidentally. Even when we began the special military operation, we were always open to contact, were ready to answer questions, were ready to explain what was happening. They cut off all channels of communication. And when President Trump came and said that this was wrong, that he had not started this war, and that in any case he had inherited this war, and that he wanted to end it, and wanted to establish dialogue with President Putin. Dialogue was established very quickly. They spoke by phone as well. Then in February of last year, there was a meeting with Marco Rubio and the then National Security Advisor, with me and with Yuri Ushakov in Geneva. It was an open conversation. A conversation in which it was said that ideology must be set aside, that one must be guided by national interests, which both Russia and the United States, and other states, of course, have. Before this, Mr. Witkoff several times visited Moscow on behalf of Donald Trump, set out ideas, and then the Americans formalized these ideas by the time of the Alaska meeting, and conveyed them to us. Comments on this score were made by all participants, including our president and your humble servant. And speaking briefly, We accepted the proposal that was made to us in Alaska. We remain committed. The President has reminded of this more than once. We remain committed to that agreement. It is not our fault that literally a flock, it is difficult to call what happened otherwise, from Europe immediately rushed to work on the American administration so that it would not agree to its own proposal, so that it would not insist on it, so that it would withdraw it. I cited to you at the beginning what is now being said and what is now being put front and center. Let us somehow stop somewhere, while at the same time Zelensky says, and we recognize nothing, that there is some Russian. What referendums, what Crimea, what Donbass, that's all ours. We will simply proceed from the premise that it remains temporarily occupied. This is not what was proposed in Anchorage. There, the talk was of de jure recognition of the realities on the ground, and that was a proposal by the United States. And at the same time, they say, well, now let us freeze somewhere on the ground. Zelensky will explain to the people that we are conceding nothing, and then we, the West, will guarantee the security of the remaining Ukrainian regime without changing anything in it, not changing its Nazi essence, not with regard to the crudest violations of human rights and the rights of national minorities, linguistic, religious, and with regard to the glorification of Nazism, which is legislatively enshrined and actively applied in practice among them. Our relations with the USA are not at a freezing point. Our relations are open. We communicate regularly at the most varied levels and are always ready for contacts. Some contacts we initiate ourselves. Some are conducted at the request of the American side. We do not speak of all of them because we consider it important not so much to wave the flag of developing relations with the USA as to resolve issues, and very often practical results depend on how much silence is maintained. But I have said this more than once. I want to record it once more. We have no illusions regarding what goals the USA really has in mind when declaring that now, unlike Biden and other Democrats, they are guided by national interests. National interests are enshrined in a whole range of doctrinal documents, including the National Security Strategy and the Energy Strategy, in which the goal of dominating energy markets is directly stated. This goal is being actively pursued. This includes Venezuelan oil, and now around Iranian oil as well. They are trying to construct various combinations with an eye to deriving benefit from Iranian oil in one form or another. Look at what decisions have been made already by the Trump administration. Not simply extending Biden's sanctions. All the sanctions introduced against us by Biden are being extended, but decisions were made regarding Lukoil and Rosneft. They are being pushed out of all projects of an international character, leaving only activity inside Russia, with the rarest exceptions. Therefore, we look at the situation soberly. Of course, we are interested in the fact that when the Ukrainian crisis is settled on the basis of full consideration of Russia's legitimate interests, we will naturally be interested in restoring and resuming investment cooperation with those countries that will be ready to do this on an equal, mutually respectful, and mutually beneficial basis. In our sense, such intentions, such companies that are ready to work on these terms in the United States do exist, and there is also interest from the administration. But let us see what remains of the promising, mutually beneficial projects by the time the USA says, well, thank goodness, we have settled Ukraine. Let us now talk business. For now, they talk about business only in a theoretical sense. Let us sort out Ukraine, and then there will be this, this, and this. There may be very little left by the time the Americans propose beginning such a conversation in a business-like manner. And I want to conclude by saying that the situation in the world once again confirms that the upcoming anniversaries this year of our relations with the People's Republic of China will be devoted not only to ceremonial events, although this is very important. It is important to maintain among our public opinion, both in Russia and in China, it is important to maintain awareness of the significance of our friendship, our strategic partnership, our readiness to act shoulder to shoulder in current conditions. And of course, these anniversary contacts will to a large extent be devoted to defining our common interests and working out concrete approaches to advancing these interests in conditions of the most profound changes on the international arena. When the world, as a result of the West's attempts to preserve its dominance, is transitioning from globalization to the fragmentation of development processes, a fragmentation which is the forced form of liberation from diktat within the framework of those mechanisms of the world economy and world finance that were created at the West's initiative and continue to be controlled by it. Major reforms are maturing, and the role of such structures as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20 in shaping new mechanisms of global governance will, of course, only grow. And in this sense, the new recent initiative of Beijing, put forward at the end of August of last year, the Global Governance Initiative, which is now being actively considered in terms of forming the structures that could engage in this. This initiative is very, very timely. Today, Chairman Xi Jinping, when receiving our delegation, spoke of the significance of this initiative for consolidating the world majority in favor of efforts to ensure the manageability and orderliness of international relations on the basis of, once again this was emphasized, the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Here we and our Chinese friends have an enormous field of further work. Thank you very much. Especially given that the international situation, which is now being aggravated by the actions of our Western colleagues in Ukraine, in Latin America, in the Strait of Hormuz, and in other parts of our common Eurasian continent with China, this international situation has a direct impact on how bilateral relations develop between any states, including, of course, between Russia and China, between Russia and China, and our other partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in BRICS, and in other multilateral associations. In this regard, we reviewed how the agreements reached by President Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping on building trade, economic, and investment cooperation are being fulfilled in such a way as to protect it from the harmful influence of those who rely not on their ability to compete fairly, but on sanctions and other illegal methods of coercion, blackmail, and diktat. And of course, we noted that we are successfully coping with these tasks that were set at the highest level. For the fourth year in a row, trade turnover exceeds $200 billion. This goal was set at one point, achieved ahead of schedule, and it is steadily maintained as the foundation of our material and practical cooperation. Specialized structures, above all the mechanism of annual meetings of heads of government and the 5 intergovernmental commissions that operate within this mechanism at the level of deputy prime ministers, are addressing tasks in a wide variety of areas, starting with energy, which of course takes on special significance in current conditions, but also including high technologies, space, research in the field of nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, education, and culture. Speaking of humanitarian issues, in January of this year, President Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping launched yet another, already the 14th, cross-year. This time, unlike previous years of culture, it is a cross-year of education. As part of the preparation of President Putin's visit to China in the first half of this year, we proposed that special attention be paid to this area of education in preparing the summit agenda. And of course, on the international front, we are interested in countering the blatant attempts by the West, both the United States and Europe, to maintain and in some places even renew their hegemony, counting on the fact that 500